Okay, so this, let's see here, about the middle, a little more than the middle of my great Messianic Psalm series. Not great because my series is great, but because the Psalms are great. This is definitely the continuation of that series. We've done 3 Psalms so far, just to mark out where we've been. Psalm 110 was the first one I did in this series, and we saw the basic idea of the Messiah as both a king to avenge sin and a priest to atone for sin. Then we did Psalm 45. We saw the divine Messiah brings blessing to Gentiles. And then Psalm 22 was last time, from which we saw that the Messiah, through his intense suffering and death, gathers a diverse assembly of his brothers to praise God, which I now realize is the wordiest of all of my summary statements so far, but there was a lot happening in Psalm 22. Hopefully I was able to cover all of that in a way that'll be remembered. So that brings us to message number 4 in this series, which is Psalm 16. And I'm going to go ahead and read this one right now. Psalm 16, a miktam of David. Preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good besides you. As for the saints who are in the earth, they are the majestic ones in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who have bartered for another god will be multiplied. I shall not pour out their drink offerings of blood, nor will I take their names upon my lips. The Lord is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You support my lot. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me. I will bless the Lord who has counseled me. Indeed, my mind instructs me in the night. I have set the Lord continually before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. So what is this great Messianic psalm really about in terms of its general theme? Well, I titled this message, The Joy of the Deathless Messiah, which I think does summarize pretty well in one phrase what this psalm is getting at. So Psalm 16 is going to show us the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God. If you want a more expanded version of the summary, it's about the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God. Now my outline has 4 points, and I guess you could say the first 2 are more about this general idea of the Messiah in kind of a predictive sense, and then the last 2 are going to come back around to Jesus himself as the fulfillment of this psalm. So 4 points really though. Point 1, that Psalm 16 concludes with the Messiah being delivered from death to God's right hand. And that is just the conclusion of the psalm, not the main theme. The main theme I come back around to in point number 2, which is again just a restatement of what I said the main idea was, that Psalm 16 shows us the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God, which I think is the running theme of the entire psalm. It'd be very easy to focus on the conclusion of the psalm, just the way we often make use of it based on its New Testament use, but there's a lot more going on than just that. And I really want to come around and focus on the joy that we see the Messiah have in this passage. Thirdly, this is where we get more into talking about Christ himself, Jesus himself that is, that Jesus fulfills the expectation of a Messiah delivered from death to God's right hand. So just going back to that first point and showing fulfillment. And then fourth, that Jesus has become the perfect model for joy's power. So I guess you could say points 1 and 3 are kind of together, and then points 2 and 4 are kind of together because they revisit what was happening in the first half of the message. So, just one more thing to say before moving into all of that. I again want to cover why I consider this psalm to be a great messianic psalm, why it has made it into this very exclusive list of psalms that I, for some reason, have put on the top part of the list for these psalms that deal with the person and work of the Messiah. Well, my reason is simply the habit of early Christian preaching to make use of this psalm. And we see this in the book of Acts as we see the gospel begin to start moving. We see, first of all, that Psalm 16 is used in the very first Christian sermon ever. And I am referring to Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, verses 24 through 33. We see him make use of this psalm as he preaches that message. He says, "But God raised Jesus up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. For David says of him, I saw the Lord always in my presence, for he is at my right hand, so that I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue exulted. Moreover, my flesh also will live in hope, because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence," which is from Psalm 16. The wording is a little different because he's using the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was common back then, and they're translating from that here in the book of Acts. But that is Psalm 16. And he keeps going with it. "Brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. And so, because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, having been exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured forth this which you both see and hear." So you see, a pretty good chunk of the first Christian sermon ever was dedicated to explaining the significance of Psalm 16. And then the second example I have is the very first sermon that we have recorded from the Apostle Paul. So certainly an important figure in the spread of Christianity. He also makes reference to this, Acts 13, verses 35 through 37. This is the first sermon that we have recorded from the Apostle Paul. So starting in verse 35, "Therefore he also says in another psalm, you will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay," end quotation. "For David, after he had served his purpose, the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. But he whom God raised did not undergo decay," that being a reference to Jesus. So very often here in the first sermons we have recorded in all of Christianity, you see Psalm 16 get used very often. As they're going around, usually doing their evangelism to Jews, they go to Psalm 16. So apparently it was very important to them, and they thought it very useful for preaching the gospel for the first time to unbelievers, especially to unbelieving Jews. So that is why I have included this in my Great Messianic Psalm series. So what I want to do now is get moving into these 4 points that I gave you. The first one being that Psalm 16 concludes with the Messiah being delivered from death to God's right hand. Now this again is not the chief theme of Psalm 16, but it is the climax of Psalm 16. It is where the whole thing is going. And I do want to spend time on it because this is the part of the psalm that was quoted in the 2 passages I just read from the book of Acts. So it is somewhat weighty for understanding it as a Christian. Now I want to begin by arguing that the ideas of this psalm do not match the life of David. That as David writes this psalm, he is not talking about himself. It is very easy to get that impression simply because it is a psalm of David, written by him. So naturally, we might just think by instinct that David is describing some experience of his own. And that is exactly how a lot of people understand Psalm 16. And when I say a lot of people, I mean to include some Christians in that. There are plenty of Christians who very frankly say that Peter and Paul are not quite right in their understanding of the psalm. That they say, well, that's maybe not the best way to understand it. They don't want to come right out and say they're wrong, but they don't exactly see Peter and Paul being right in their use of Psalm 16. A lot of people and a lot of Christians just think that David is describing some experience in his own life and that he's asking God to deliver him from some immediate threat. Maybe he's in a battle and under threat of death that way. Maybe there's some kind of illness. But in whatever sense, they think that David is just asking God on his own behalf to deliver him from some immediate deadly situation. My problem with that is the ideas of the psalm just don't fit that kind of situation. It is not a good match for that kind of scenario. And specifically at this point, I would refer to the speaker's expectation of going into the presence of God after he is delivered from death, which is how the psalm ends. Verses 10 through 11. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. So I find this strange because the speaker of this psalm implies that being delivered from death is going into God's presence, which is usually not how it works, is it? Usually if you're delivered from death, you get to stay on earth because you've been delivered from death. God, meanwhile, is in heaven. So if you were going into God's presence, you'd be going into heaven, right? So those are two different ideas. If you're delivered from death, you do not go into God's presence. And if you die, you go into God's presence. That's how it normally works. But here in this psalm, you get a mix of ideas here where the speaker is delivered from death and therefore goes into the presence of God. It doesn't really seem to match this idea of David being in some kind of tight spot and being delivered from death, and now he's just praising God about it. The whole idea of going into the presence of God after this just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We need to explain Psalm 16 in a way that explains that detail, showing it to be about a man who is delivered from death and then, having been delivered from death, actually gets to go into the presence of God alive, which is not a normal thing at all, but nonetheless what happens in Psalm 16. And for that reason, I come to the conclusion that we're talking about the Messiah. We are talking about this great king that is coming, who is going to rule God's kingdom on his behalf. And to do that, I want to talk about Psalm 21, which is a psalm I've been mentioning over the past several weeks, hoping to prompt your attention to read that psalm and understand it. So I want to go there. So go ahead and turn to Psalm 21 if you want to. I'll just be reading the first 6 verses of that psalm. But to give you a heads up as to why I consider this psalm important, Psalm 21 describes a king who asked God to give him life and who was given an endless life to rejoice in the presence of God. To say that again, Psalm 21 describes a king who asked God to give him life and who was given an endless life to rejoice in the presence of God. And I hope some of those themes you're already linking to Psalm 16. But right now I want to read Psalm 21, verses 1 through 6. And I hope you'll see why I consider it messianic. Psalm 21, for the choir director, a psalm of David. O Lord, in your strength the king will be glad, and in your salvation how greatly he will rejoice. You have given him his heart's desire, and you have not withheld the request of his lips. For you meet him with the blessings of good things. You set a crown of fine gold on his head. So what does this king want anyway? What was he asking of God? What was given to him? Well, he asked life of you, and you gave it to him, length of days forever and ever. His glory is great through your salvation. Splendor and majesty you place upon him, for you make him most blessed forever. You make him joyful with gladness in your presence. So, having gone through that, I say this psalm describes a king who asked God to give him life and was given an endless life to rejoice in the presence of God. Now, it would make sense for that king to be the Messiah, that we would link Psalm 21 not to any normal king, but to this great king for which the Jews had all this expectation. And I say that specifically because of the immortality mentioned. He asks for life, and God does not simply give him a normal lifespan. God gives him length of days forever and ever. He's an eternal king. He's an undying king. So not a normal king, certainly not David, nor any other king of Israel or Judah that we know of, because they all died. This king lives forever. And not only does he live forever, but that endless life that he has is spent in the presence of God, rejoicing. It says, you make him most blessed forever, you make him joyful with gladness in your presence. So here we have this king who asked God to give him life, who was given an endless life to rejoice in the presence of God forever. That's Psalm 21. And then from there we go to Psalm 16, and what do we have? We see a man destined to spend his endless life rejoicing in the presence of God, because he's delivered from death into the presence of God to rejoice there. So is it so foolish to suggest, based on that Psalm 16 is about the same person? Because they seem really, really similar. Both of them ask God to give them life. God gives them life. And from there, in the context of them having life, they get to be in the presence of God rejoicing. Sounds like the same story. So Psalm 16, Psalm 21 seem to be about the same guy. But Psalm 21 is very much about this king, this endless immortal king who experiences those things. So we say, okay, the Messiah then. Well, if Psalm 21 and Psalm 16 are about the same thing, and Psalm 21 is about the Messiah, there's your link to Psalm 16. David is not talking about himself and some temporary deliverance from death, after which he was just going to die again. Instead, he is talking about the Messiah who asks God to give him life, and God gives him life, and that life is spent rejoicing in the presence of God. And that is my argument that this psalm is not about David, but about the Messiah. Now, if you're still doubtful on that point, I have one more detail to point out here. And that is that this speaker is also God's right-hand man, at the right hand of God. Because it's not just being in the presence of God. Verse 11 of Psalm 16, you will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. So you see this man associated with the right hand of God. Now, if you're using the ESV, it says that this person is at God's right hand. At your right hand are pleasures forever. So that's a very messianic idea, isn't it? I mean, Psalm 110, we've seen this before. Where does the Messiah end up forever? Where does he rule from? He rules from God's right hand. Well, here, Psalm 16, this guy is at God's right hand, just like the Messiah would be. Now, if you're using the NASB like I am, it says there are pleasures in God's right hand. And I spent some time looking at that difference in translation. Is it at God's right hand? Is it in God's right hand? Just referring more to the location of those joys there. And I spent some time on that. I thought it could go either way. I figured I could make an argument one way or the other for that. My point right now is it doesn't really matter, because in order to get the blessings that are in God's right hand, you have to be at God's right hand. You have to actually be there. Otherwise, you're not going to get those pleasures that are there. So really, whether you translate it in your right hand or at your right hand, we still have this person ending up at the right hand of God, being associated with God's right hand, being his right-hand man. So it's still very much an idea that sounds like the Messiah in Psalm 110, at the right hand of God. So what we have in Psalm 16, we have this person being delivered from death to God's right hand, and having been delivered from death, he somehow gets to be in the presence of God at the same time, at God's right hand, enjoying the pleasures that are in God's right hand, all in the context of him living, not dying and going to heaven, but living and being with God in his presence. All of which I conclude being a very messianic idea as we draw back to Psalm 21 and Psalm 110. So that's my argument, that we're dealing here with the Messiah being delivered from death to God's right hand. But that, however, is only the climax of Psalm 16. It is not the main theme. I jumped there in order to make a messianic argument to get you on the same page as I am. But right now I want to talk about my second point here, which is actually, you would call the main point of this whole psalm, that Psalm 16 shows us the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God. Emphasis on the word joy. This is really what I consider to be the main point of the message. We're not just talking about the Messiah being delivered from death. We're talking about the joy he has in God as he reflects on these things. And I want to do this in several stages. I have about 7 headings under this second point here that I want to go through. Going through the entire psalm, really, not necessarily in order. But to start in verse 1, we see first of all that the Messiah's joy in God gives him confidence in God's preservation. He believes that God will preserve him because he rejoices in God. That's his whole argument that he makes to himself and to God even. Look at verse 1. Preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you. Okay, so the psalm begins with him making this request for God to preserve his life. Now the question is, on what basis does this man ask God to preserve him? How dare you go before God with a request? You better have some kind of argument to make. Well, the first part of his argument is that he takes refuge in God. The second part of his argument is he rejoices in God. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good besides you. So those are the arguments he makes as he's trying to convince God to preserve his life. He says, do this, God, because I take refuge in you and because I have no good besides you. He is willing to look at all of the things that he has and count them as bad so that he can count God as his only good and say, I have no good besides you. Therefore, God, on that basis, preserve me. And that is his source of confidence. He can come before God in the confidence that God will hear him because he has joy in the Lord. The Messiah's joy in God gives him confidence in God's preservation. Secondly, after that, the Messiah's confidence in God's preservation gives him more joy. He goes from having joy in the Lord to having confidence from that joy, and then that confidence in turn gives him even more joy. It's like it's building on itself. Look at verses 8 through 10. It says, I have set the Lord continually before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. So the Messiah comes to realize that God will indeed preserve him. He will not be shaken, his flesh will dwell securely, and his soul will not be abandoned to Sheol, which is the place of the dead that you often see in the Old Testament. He comes to realize that God will indeed preserve him. He's saying these things, God will not let this happen to me. God is going to preserve my life. And as he realizes this, his heart is glad and his glory rejoices. He becomes full of even more joy. His original joy has spiraled upward into an even greater joy through that confidence that he has. So the Messiah's confidence in God's preservation gives him even more joy. He says, therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. So he started out with joy, and now he gets even more joy. He just keeps going up and up in his joy in the Lord. Furthermore, the Messiah believes that other gods bring only sorrow. He does not at all entertain this idea that you can be happy serving this god or that god. In his view, only one God brings joy, and that is the true God. Look at verse 4. He says, the sorrows of those who have bartered for another god will be multiplied. I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood, nor will I take their names upon my lips. Sorrows. As the Messiah's joy grows, he expects other men to fall into greater and greater sorrow as they serve their other gods. So he takes, all of the other gods in the world that people might worship, and he puts them over here, and he says all of those just bring not just sorrow, but multiplying sorrow. The sorrows of those who have bartered for another god will be multiplied. As his joy goes up, their sorrow grows up. They're going the complete opposite direction in terms of what they feel as they serve their gods. Meanwhile, going back to the Messiah here, the Messiah is pleased to own nothing but God himself. This is similar to this idea of him having no good besides God. Well, here he is pleased to own nothing but God. Verses 5 through 6, "The Lord is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me." So you have these words here: portion, inheritance, lot, boundary line, heritage. All of that is the language of ownership, specifically land ownership, which is very important in Israel from the time they went into their land and divided up the land and set everyone, their family inheritances. Those are the words that they use to describe ownership. But for this person, the Messiah, God is what he owns. God is his portion, his inheritance, his lot, his boundary lines, his heritage. God is those things for him. And you might say, well, it sounds like he got the short end of the deal here. I mean, all he owns is God. But to him, he calls that pleasant and beautiful. Doesn't sound like he wants anything else. He's pretty pleased to own nothing but God as he meditates on God as his God. Fifth thing, the Messiah blesses God for instructing him. Verse 7, "I will bless the Lord who has counseled me. Indeed, my mind instructs me in the night." Now, at night, you're supposed to be sleeping, right? This is the time when you're supposed to recharge your batteries for the next day. And to be kept awake at night, therefore, is usually a bad thing because it means you're going to be very low energy the next day. So when you have these nights you just can't fall asleep, it gets kind of stressful. If you're like me, it's just like, oh, what am I going to do tomorrow? I'm going to be worthless. Well, for the Messiah, being kept awake at night is a cause of blessing, so long as he's being kept awake because God is counseling him. He has one of these maybe all-night fellowship sessions with the Lord in which God is instructing him, and he doesn't get any sleep that night, but for him that's a good thing because God is with him and God is counseling him. Most people would be grumpy at that, but not him. He actually blesses God for that. It shows you another form of his joy in the Lord, that he responds that way to that. Then sixthly, under this point, the Messiah delights in the people of God. You might say, this guy goes on about God so much, is there anything else that makes him happy? Does he take joy in anything or anyone else? And the answer is yes, and that is the people of God. Verse 3, "As for the saints who are in the earth, they are the majestic ones in whom is all my delight." So the only other people, the only other persons who make the Messiah happy is the people of God. So you have these, so he gets away from God for a few seconds, but these are people who probably remind him of God in some way, and so he has delight in them. He even goes so far as to say that they're all his delight, which is kind of funny given the rest of the psalm, given that he's rambling on about how much he's happy in God. And now he says, the people of God, they're all my delight. Well, it sounds like a bit of exaggeration there, but the point is, he delights in the people of God as well. So the only other thing in this psalm that makes the Messiah pleased are other people who are associated with God, like he is. And then finally, on this topic of the joy of the Messiah here, the Messiah moves from greater joy into fullness of joy as God preserves his life and brings him into God's presence. I said that the Messiah began with joy in God, and then he moved into greater joy when he became confident of God's preservation. Well, now the Messiah moves from that greater joy into fullness of joy. Verse 11, "In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever." So by this point, the Messiah, just following the chronology given by other psalms that we've seen, by this point, being in the presence of God at God's right hand, he's king of the world, right? He has ascended as high as anyone can go. And the thing he likes most about this is the fact that he's there in God's presence in fullness of joy, experiencing the pleasures that are in God's right hand. That's what he wants. I mean, it's all about God and the blessings of being with God for him. So here you see him moving from his great joy that we see throughout the psalm into fullness of joy. And that is why I say, you see this throughout the whole psalm. I don't know if you were keeping track. I did them out of order, I admit that. But I just went through every verse of the psalm, and every single verse is about how he's rejoicing in the Lord. That's the whole theme of this psalm. Psalm 16 shows us the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God. That's what Psalm 16 is really about. It may climax with specifically God preserving his life and bringing him into his presence, but the whole thing is about the joy this man has in God. Okay, that's great, but what about Jesus? The whole point of this series is to help you see how the Psalms can be used to make a credible but Christian argument for Jesus as the Messiah. So how about Jesus? How does he fit in here to Psalm 16? Well, Jesus fulfills the expectation of a Messiah delivered from death to God's right hand. I think Jesus fits the bill. If you are actively looking for this kind of Messiah, I don't think anyone actually was in the days of Jesus, but if you were looking for this kind of Messiah, Jesus would fit that description. And I am referring, of course, to the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, being raised from the dead and being taken up to God's right hand after his resurrection. Let's start with the resurrection itself. If you're looking for a man with an indestructible life, someone whom God will preserve, if you're looking for that kind of person, where better to begin than a man who was in fact murdered but then restored to life? I actually don't think there's a better place to begin at all. And you might find that contradictory. After all, if the person was actually murdered, successfully slain, doesn't that show his life is not indestructible? I mean, he was killed, right? I mean, surely, how do you call that man invincible? How do you say that God will preserve that man's life? Well, look at this from the other way. Let's say, you are brutally murdered, like by crucifixion, that people did absolutely everything they could have done to destroy you. They went all out. They didn't hold back. And then after they hit you with all they had, you walk out of your tomb alive and well. If that were to actually happen, that would be the greatest evidence of an indestructible life, because people did absolutely everything they could do to a person to kill that person, and yet that person lived. That's what I call indestructible. That's what I call a life that God will preserve. It's kind of like some of these monster movies where they spend the whole movie trying to kill the monster, and they think they got it killed, and everyone turns around to walk away, and then there's this jump scare, and the thing's still alive, and it's like, oh no, we thought this was over. Well, to the wicked people who killed Jesus, he was that monster. They wanted him dead. I mean, they were conniving for years to make that happen. And by the time it was done, I mean, think about what they did to him. They whipped his flesh until it would have been shreds on his back. I mean, they did that to him. Then they made him carry his own cross. They stretched him out on it. They nailed him down to it. When they hold you up in crucifixion like that, what happens is you're slowly suffocated to death. It's kind of like drowning in the bodily fluids that build up in your lungs. And that would last several hours, and after all of that, they pierce him with that spear. I mean, he's dead. I mean, they didn't hold back. They sought to kill him and kill him until he was dead. And then after all of that, resurrection. Didn't work. Absolutely nothing availed. I mean, they hit him with everything they had, and God preserved his life by raising him even from death, to the point where the cells in his body would have stopped working. All the machinery is shutting down and shut down and gone, ready for the decay process. At that moment, God says, nope, he lives. That is an indestructible life right there. That is a life that God will preserve. What conclusion can we draw from the resurrection of Jesus, but that Jesus had an indestructible life just like the Messiah was supposed to have in Psalm 16? Seems like a fair conclusion. Okay, well that's the resurrection. What about the ascension? What about this act in which God takes Jesus up to be at his right hand in his presence. Well, that would also fit Psalm 16. And the early church, certainly that was important to them. The early church would appeal to witnesses, saying that they saw Jesus not only rise from the dead, but ascend up into heaven. And they would appeal to those witnesses, but the question I ask for you is, what good is that to you? I mean, you don't know those witnesses. They're all dead now. You can't examine them. How do you know this? How do you know that Jesus actually did rise from the dead and ascend to God's right hand? Because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, Psalm 16 talks about this Messiah who was going to be preserved by God and then taken up into God's presence. And the gospel of Jesus Christ tells that story about Jesus. But how do you know that? I mean, seriously, how do you know this actually happened? How do we know Jesus really fits that description? Well, the argument that I always make, and I've made this before, so it's probably familiar, is just looking at the evidence. And by the evidence, I mean the evidence that we see in the church. And that is to say that the things you see happening among us and in church history and among Christians is the best argument I can make that Jesus really did ascend to heaven after being raised from the dead. Think about the spread of Christianity, how we just keep going. We started off as a kind of a cult when you think about it. You know, like what's a cult? Well, this weird group, a small group of people, they have kind of these weird beliefs, you know, one charismatic leader. Usually they fall apart after the leader dies. Well, that was kind of what Christianity was doomed to be, except that it became more. I mean, from that one little group of guys, you get this worldwide religion. And not just a worldwide religion, but a religion that has spread primarily through peaceful means. For the most part, it's been through preaching and missionaries and things like that. So you have that going on. Kind of unusual. Usually those cults die after their leaders die, but not this one. This one endured and spread all over the whole world. How about the survival of Christianity in spite of all of the persecution? Sometimes it's bad press. Sometimes it's people trying to kill us. There's a little bit of everything across the world at one time. But there's always this opposition going on toward us. And yet somehow we just keep going. The gospel keeps spreading. Even in times when we're being persecuted more brutally than in normal times, it seems like we just keep spreading even in those cases. The blood of the martyrs is seed, is what Tertullian once said, one of these early church writers. Well, you keep killing Christians and you keep making Christians by doing that. It just seems like that's how it works when you look at the history of persecution among Christians. Finally, how about the success of Christianity in accomplishing its goals? We were supposed to spread to every nation on the planet, and we're almost there. We might see it within the next century. We might actually see that happen. But how about, more humble goals like in people's lives, removing burdens? Jesus said that if you come to Him, He'll remove your burdens. His burden is light. His yoke is light. Well, people have experienced that. Has any religion done so well at accomplishing its own goals? I mean, you have all this stuff. How do you explain all this? How do you explain a religion that should have died out 2,000 years ago, that should have been stomped out by persecution but hasn't been, and which continues to meet its goals for 2,000 years? When something spectacular happens to a person, you might hear them say, oh, someone up there really loves me. When they win the lottery or they survive some kind of terrible car wreck or whatever, they say, oh, someone up there really loves me. Well, as Christians, I think we can conclude that someone up there actually does love us, and His name is Jesus. Because without Him up there at the right hand of God reigning, I can't explain what we've experienced. I can't explain church history. I can't explain this thing we call the gospel and why it keeps on spreading in power. It's much like Peter says in Pentecost sermon, chapter 2 of Acts. The way he ends that section there. Therefore, having been exalted to the right hand of God and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, He has poured forth this which you see and hear. You want to explain this? Jesus is at the right hand of God. That was His explanation, and that's my explanation. On that basis, I say Jesus was preserved by God, and He did ascend to God's right hand, and He is in God's presence right now, just like Psalm 16 says about the Messiah. Based on all of that, through the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, I think He fulfills Psalm 16, which is why the early Christians were using it so often in their messages. It became a very good text to use for them to talk about Jesus and how he fulfills expectations for the Messiah. Now, before moving on to my fourth and final point here, I want to answer an objection. And the objection is this: how can Jesus fulfill Psalm 16 when he did see decay? And that's the way I'm phrasing the question. Psalm 16, to go back there, you read some of the wording here. Psalm 16, verse 10 says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay," or see decay would be the more literal translation. Okay, now Jesus was dead for 3 days, right? Now, after 3 days of being dead, really the moment you die, the whole decay process starts. Everything starts shutting down. It doesn't take long for rigor mortis to set in, and after a few days, people are going to notice that your body is starting to undergo all of that. It kind of slows down for us because we do all this stuff after people die, and you go to the funeral home and all that. There's embalming fluids and stuff like that, kind of slow down the process. But back then they didn't have that, and decay really does become evident very soon after death. So it seems Jesus, being dead for about 3 days, he's going to start seeing some of that decay process start. Then you have other translation of this verse. I don't know what you have in your footnotes, but some people translate the word decay, they translate it as the pit, which is one of these other terms that the Hebrews use to describe the place of the dead. They have Sheol, but they also have the pit. Well, Jesus was dead for 3 days. He would have been in the place of the dead, so it seems like Jesus would have seen the pit for a while, for about 3 days there, as he was waiting to be raised from the dead. So the question here is, and people ask this question, and I want to answer this question, how can Jesus fulfill this psalm when it seems like in some sense he did see decay, that he would have seen the pit, the place of the dead? How do we say Jesus fulfilled this when it doesn't seem to exactly match the language of the psalm? Well, that is a very good question. And I cannot communicate to you how much energy I burn trying to answer this question, because this is one of the big questions I have had for a long time about this psalm. But here's the answer that I'm comfortable giving, and this is going to change the way you read the psalm, perhaps. I don't know how you've been reading it. Maybe you've always believed this and I'm just sort of short in coming to it. But I believe that verses 9 through 11 are meant to be spoken after the resurrection of Jesus. So I'm going to read those verses again, and instead of thinking of Jesus saying these things before his death, think of Jesus saying these things after his resurrection. That is my advice to you. So let's read those again. Verses 9 through 11. "Therefore, my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see decay. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forevermore." Now my theory is that those are the words of a man who has seen death, has seen decay, and has seen the pit, and who is rejoicing that he will never see them again because God is going to preserve him forever from this time onward. That is my understanding of those verses, that we're not talking about what Jesus says before his death, we're talking about what Jesus says after his resurrection. So maybe you've always read the psalm that way, maybe you've never read the psalm that way, but that is the way I have come to read it. And if it means anything to you, and I hope it does, I think that is how the Apostle Paul reads the psalm. So I want to go to Acts 13 and show you that. I think this is how Paul understands this part of the psalm. Again, answering this objection, how can we apply Psalm 16 to Jesus when it seems like he did see decay for at least a little bit, did see the place of the dead for at least a little bit? How do we reconcile that with the fact that Jesus died and actually would have seen those things, whereas in Psalm 16 it seems like he's not going to see those things? Well, the way Paul uses this psalm, he says something kind of interesting. He says that Jesus did but did not see decay. And I'm not trying to be wittily contradictory there, That actually is what Paul says. He says that Jesus did and yet did not see decay. Acts 13, verses 34, really just verse 34. Acts 13, verse 34, what Paul says here, as for the fact that he raised him up from the dead, no longer to return to decay. And we're just going to cut off there. So that is how Paul describes this. He says that God raised Jesus from the dead, no longer to return to decay. But what does that mean? Okay, it means of an implication that Jesus actually did see decay a little bit. If he's never going to return to decay, he must have actually been in that state at some point in those 3 days, which is understandable. Jesus was dead. His body was shut down. Decomposition begins very quickly. Okay, he would have seen decay at some point in that process. And Paul says when he was raised from the dead, he will no longer return to that. So according to Paul's thinking, Jesus did see decay, but he also did not undergo decay. Verse 37, what does he say? But he whom God raised did not undergo decay. So it's like, okay, Paul, what is it here? So did Jesus see decay or not? You say he's not going to return to decay, which means he was in decay at some point, but then you say he did not see decay. Just, what's going on here? What is the explanation here? Why is Paul phrasing it this way? Well, the explanation is simple enough. The reason why Paul is using this doublespeak is because, on the one hand, Jesus did see decay in that he really did die and laid in a tomb for 3 days. If that happened to you, you'd be decaying too. So Jesus really did see decay, but he did not see decay because once he was raised from the dead, his life became indestructible. We have this saying that you start to die the moment you're born. I mean, the stuff that happens to you is all contributing to your death eventually. Well, for Jesus, after his resurrection, that was not the case. He had a truly indestructible life from that point on, and from that point on, you can truly say of him, he did not see decay from that point on. Paul is just covering the before and after. You look at Jesus during his death, yeah, there's a man that saw decay. But you look at Jesus after his resurrection, raised up never to die again, there's a man who did not see decay. He was taken way out of that realm of death and brought into a realm of indestructible life. But that means he views the psalm rather like I do. He would view verses 9 through 11, as I read them earlier, as referring not to Jesus speaking before his death, but speaking after his resurrection. Because only at that time does Paul say he did not see decay. So again, verses 9 through 11, I view these as being spoken by Jesus after his resurrection. Just to read them again to you in that context. Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see decay. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. So, in my understanding of the psalm, those are the words of a man who has seen decay at some point, who did see the place of the dead, and who is now rejoicing that he will never go back there again because God has decided to preserve his life forever. That is the way I understand it. I think Paul understands it the same way, and that is how I would teach the psalm. The only question that really remains there is, could you kind of justify this from the psalm itself, or at least maybe from the Old Testament? Let's say you were a Jew back before the time of Jesus, kind of working this stuff out on your own. Could you put that together? Could you figure out that the Messiah is talking about being preserved alive forever after he has actually tasted death and seen decay and maybe even seen the pit, the place of the dead? Could you work that out? Well, you might be able to based on Psalm 22. Remember in Psalm 22, the Messiah describes himself as being laid in the dust of death after all this torturous stuff these people are doing to him, piercing his hands and his feet and all that. Well, it sounds like the Messiah dies there, right? So you come to Psalm 16, you see him rejoicing that God is preserving him from death. You put that all together, what do you get? You get the picture of a man who dies, but then God decides to preserve his life, and so raises him from the dead, and then rejoices that God has done so, rejoices that he will never again see those things, because now he's in the presence of God, being preserved alive forever. So yes, I think if you start putting these Psalms together like we've been doing this whole time, you can get the fuller picture. It's not by any means direct. That is why the New Testament describes these things as a mystery that is testified to by the law and the prophets, but nonetheless is hidden in them, because they're not exactly direct, but they are there once you start thinking about them and linking them together very slowly. And of course, it helps that we're on this side of the cross and we've seen it all fulfilled anyway, so we have some guidelines to follow. Back then would not have been as easy. Nonetheless, I think it is there and you can make the argument. So I wanted to deal with that objection just because it's been on my mind for years. I don't know if it's been on your mind at all, but that's the way I view it. And again, just to bring that back around to the point I was trying to make, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus, all of that contributes to Jesus fulfilling the expectation of this psalm, that the Messiah has a life indestructible, which he will spend in the presence of God. We see the indestructible life of the Messiah in the resurrection of Jesus, and we see his joy in the presence of God in his ascension to heaven. That is how Jesus fulfills the psalm. Now, to end all this, I just want to have one more point here. We'll make this quick. The last point I have here, that Jesus has become the perfect model of joy's power. The way I've worded that, I'm just trying to hold forth Christ to you as an example. Now, don't forget, the true theme of Psalm 16 is the joy the Messiah has in his indestructible life with God. It is about the Messiah rejoicing in the Lord in all these different ways and climaxing in his indestructible life and how that gives him fullness of joy in God's presence. All of that is framed around his joy in the Lord. Now, Jesus, as we look at him, the way he's described in Hebrews chapter 12, which I'll turn there. When we look at Jesus, we see that he had that joy in the Lord, and we see that it was because of his joy in the Lord that he endured the cross. Here's a familiar passage, Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Okay, why? And how am I supposed to do that? Can you give me any help? Well, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Now, it seems to me quite possible that the author of this letter, in this passage, actually has Psalm 16 in mind, because there are two ideas there that are very prominent that are also prominent in Psalm 16. One is the joy Jesus had in the Lord, and the other is the right hand of God. Both of those ideas are in this passage. Both of those ideas are also in Psalm 16. It's possible to me that perhaps the author has that psalm in the back of his mind. But whether he has that psalm in the back of his mind or not, he certainly has the concepts in his mind. This whole idea of the Messiah's joy, how that fuels him, how that motivates him, even to endure the death of the cross. It seems to me that linking the psalm to this passage makes sense in at least that way. Now, the observation that the author makes is that Jesus was able to endure the cross because of his joy. It was for the joy set before him. It's almost as though, if you can imagine it, as Jesus is, maybe going toward the cross, walking toward his place of crucifixion, he has kind of superimposed over his own field of vision this image of him reunited with God in heaven, in the presence of God, at God's right hand. There's all this stuff happening around him, happening to him, but what he sees as he looks out in front of him is that. The glory that is waiting for him at the right hand of God. It became the motivation for his mortification. The reason he was willing to face death, even the death of the cross, was because he knew at the end of it, and once he got past that, he was going to go into the presence of God and have that glory and have that joy being at God's right hand. And that was what kept him going. That is what enabled him to endure the cross. he endured because of the joy set before him. Which is why cultivating a joy in the Lord is so important. That's why that as Christians, that should be a focus of our own, I don't know if you want to call it your spiritual disciplines, if you call it those things, but as you think about your life as a Christian, one of the things you should aim to have is a sincere joy in God. Because Hebrews 12 does not just make an assertion about the life of Jesus, he makes an application based on that life to you. He says, "Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Well, no one wants to grow weary. No one wants to lose heart. So how do you keep from doing that? Well, you replace that by having a mentality like Christ, focusing on the joy set before you, so that you, like Jesus, can endure those kinds of things. If you want that kind of power to face anything that confronts you in your life, you have a model in Christ. And the way he did that was to keep his eyes fixed on the joy set before him. His joy in the Lord, the idea of being reunited with God at his right hand. If you have a similar mindset, you can do what Jesus did, but only if you cultivate that kind of joy that he had. So it's good to ask this, and be sure you keep asking that, whether it is the focus of your life so far as a Christian. Has this been on your mind? The Christian is, of course, a little Christ. That's what that means. We're supposed to emulate Christ in some way. Well, Jesus had his mind set on things above. And it wasn't just that he thought about those things all the time. That was his motivation. That was his goal. That was what was pulling him forward through all the stuff he had to endure during his time on earth, and certainly as he approached the time of his death. That's what fueled him, and you're supposed to be like that. Let yourself realize the smallness of present joys so that you can see more clearly the largeness of the later joys. It's not morbid thinking, it's motivating thinking. It's the way the Christian is supposed to keep his life on track and full of energy so that we do not grow weary and so that we do not lose heart. It's very much a focus of the Christian life when understood from a biblical standpoint, especially viewing the example of Christ. So in that way, Jesus has become our perfect model for joy's power. We're supposed to look at him and do likewise. So Psalm 16 is not just about the Messiah and his joy in the Lord and how Jesus fulfilled those things with his indestructible life and then ascended to heaven, the end. No, it doesn't end there. Jesus, in that whole gamut of things that I just described, becomes for us a model, so that Psalm 16 should be applied to us, so that we can rejoice in those same kinds of things as you go through those verses and see all the ways that the Messiah is just rejoicing in the Lord. We should be able to do that just like Jesus did. So Psalm 16, far implications for us in the Christian life, as Jesus becomes our model of the power of joy, rejoicing in the Lord. Which is as much as I wanted to say about this psalm. I'll give you a summary here. I believe this psalm, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but as I was just studying it, I feel like it was the more complicated of them. I mentioned to you I spent a long time thinking about that objection I was dealing with. So, I don't know. Here's my summary just to kind of tie it all together for you, and then we'll certainly open it up for questions. But I said that this, the title of my message, to give you a summary phrase, is The Joy of the Deathless Messiah. To give you the more expanded summary statement, Psalm 16 shows us the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God. But the key word to each is just the joy that Jesus has. So first of all, my first point was that Psalm 16 concludes with the Messiah being delivered from death to God's right hand. I made the whole argument that David doesn't really fit the psalm. It looks more like a messianic psalm based on other psalms that we see. And so therefore it's about the Messiah being delivered from death to God's right hand. Secondly, I went through the psalm and showed you that it shows the joy of an indestructible life granted to the Messiah by God. That in every detail of the psalm, it's a man rejoicing in the Lord. Thirdly, that Jesus fulfills the expectation of a Messiah delivered from death to God's right hand, primarily in his resurrection and in his ascension. In his resurrection, we see the indestructible life that God has sworn to preserve no matter what, no matter how much wrath and murderous rage came against Jesus. God was going to preserve his life, and he did so. And then secondly, the ascension, where Jesus goes to be at God's right hand. That is how Psalm 16 is fulfilled in all this talk about being in the presence of God. That was point 3. And then finally, Jesus has become the perfect model for joy's power, seeing that specifically in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, which may very well be based on Psalm 16, very similar in the very least. And that is Psalm 16. Next time, I have changed my plans, surprise, surprise, from my outline for this series. I have decided to do Psalm 118. I've been back and forth on whether I'm going to do that one or not, but I've decided I'm going to do Psalm 118, and the next time I speak, which should be Wednesday, I will actually speak on Psalm 118. And then after that, my next message will be Psalm 2, and that'll be the last of the great Messianic Psalms that I teach on and the end of the series. So next time, you get to read the very, very long, but very, very good Psalm 118, and I'll talk about that the next time I speak. For now, do we have any questions on Psalm 16? I feel like I have had a lot of questions for many years, so if you have questions, that is no surprise to me. I'll try to answer them as well as I can.